Foreign policy has been a tripwire for the American right for quite a long time. There was this idealistic sense that people all around the world naturally have a craving not only for freedom, but for freedom specifically as Americans understand it. Now, this is tremendously naive. Kirk, Nisbet, and Weaver, they're three of the founding fathers of conservatism as it develops after World War II. And all three of them thought that there was a Over the past 2 weeks, both the Middle East and the American right have gone from a state of war to a condition of uneasy peace. There's been a great deal of argument among the supporters of President Trump, among the Make America Great movement, about the question of what America's foreign policy should be and how much involvement we should have in the war that Israel has recently been fighting against Iran. Now, foreign policy has been a tripwire for the American right for quite a long time. You may recall that during the Iraq War, for example, in 2003, there was a tendency for supporters of President Bush to say that all conservatives should be supporting this war with Iraq, and that anyone who is a dissenter, such as Pat Buchanan or the columnist Robert Novak and a number of others, that these dissenters on the right who were conservatives, who were critical of George W. Bush's foreign policy, were somehow, in the words of David Frum, unpatriotic conservatives, or people who were not truly conservative at all, but who were sounding a lot like the left in criticizing a Republican president's war. Now, in the 20-plus years since the Iraq War of 2003, the situation is very much reversed, and it turns out that the critics of the Iraq War, people like Pat Buchanan and Robert Novak, have been vindicated, and they were correct. Whereas the supporters of the war, who often said that this would bring about a series of beneficial changes to the Middle East, that it would be a great flowering of liberalism and democracy throughout the region, the supporters of the Iraq War in 2003 have largely been discredited. And many of them are still around in the media, some of them are still around in government, and yet virtually no one looks back on the Iraq War and says that it was a thing that was worth doing and a success. Now, what accounts for this difference between the conservatives who supported the Iraq War in 2003 and at the time the handful of critics who correctly foresaw that the war would be a disaster? What accounts for the difference between them? And then how does that relate to today's conflict between those in the Make America Great movement who want to see America have a restrained and realistic foreign policy versus those who want America to pursue a more ambitious foreign policy, one of transforming perhaps the Middle East, of supporting Israel in the war with Iran and perhaps in future wars as well, those who see the possibilities and potential for war to bring about good, as opposed to those who see war as something that is likely to bring about a condition of chaos and disorder, both in the Middle East and ultimately as well at home. Welcome to Modern Age with Dan McCarthy, and this is the podcast that goes behind the headlines to look at the ideas, the history, the philosophy, the deeper currents that inform today's events. This is something that our publication, Modern Age, has been doing since 1957 when it was founded. We are still in print as a quarterly journal, and we also have a website where every weekday you can find the best conservative thinking and the most careful analysis of the events and the culture of our time at modernagejournal.com. Conservatives have not necessarily been the party of war throughout the last 100-plus years. And the caricature which says that the conservatives have always been hawkish or bellicose is something that really arises by accident. Certainly if you look at conservatives before the Second World War, you would actually see that there was a very strong conservative America First movement, and that was the label it used, which wanted to stay out of the Second World War. Now, that's not because these conservatives were pro-Nazi or were indifferent to the plight of Europe. It's rather because these conservatives had a very keen awareness of the way that the First World War had turned out. America had been reluctant to enter the First World War. We'd seen this as being a European war and not something that involved American interests. When we ultimately were dragged into the war by President Woodrow Wilson, we wound up being very disillusioned by the outcome. Even though America was a victor in World War I, even though we wound up being confirmed as a world power by the outcome of World War I, even though our opponent, Germany, was brought down onto its knees by the verdict of that war, we nevertheless saw that the likely result of World War I was going to be instability in Europe. It was the outcome of World War I that led to not just the rise ultimately of the Nazis, but of course, even before then, you have the creation of the Soviet Union and the rise of the Bolsheviks within Russia as a result of Russia's being involved in World War I. So World War I was an example to American conservatives of what can go wrong with a world war, that it can actually wind up ending with conditions that are as bad or worse than the conditions that were in existence before the war began, and certainly before America entered the war. It was a crisis for Western civilization as a whole. And so as they looked forward to the possibility of America getting involved in a European war in the late 1930s and the 1940s, as you had American conservatives who had memories of World War I looking at what was turning into World War II, they were very reluctant to get America involved because they correctly anticipated that the end of World War II might also include the kinds of dissatisfactions and the kinds of ongoing problems that we saw at the end of World War I. And once again, they were correct, because at the end of World War II, what happens? We find that the Soviet Union has been able to expand its sphere of power. We see that, yes, it's wonderful that we've defeated the Nazis in Germany. It's wonderful that Imperial Japan has also been defeated. But what else has happened? We've seen that Japanese imperial power in Manchuria has been replaced by Chinese communist power, and that the Chinese communists are on the verge of gaining control of all of China. We've seen that Stalin and the Soviet Union have expanded their power to take control of Eastern Europe, and America is on the verge of what will become a decades-long Cold War. So even the good war, even World War II, winds up leading to a circumstance that conservatives find very troubling. Not only that, but also the means that were employed, even by the Allies, even by the good guys in World War II, wound up leaving conservatives thinking that there was a crisis of morality within our civilization. So this includes not only the use of atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also the firebombing of civilian populations that the Allies undertook. Now, these can be argued as necessary war measures. People who defend the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki say that this was necessary to expedite the end of the war so that we did not have a prolonged conflict in the home islands of Japan, which could have gone on for years and could have led to much more bloodshed, both among American troops and also of the Japanese. So there are those who say that, in fact, dropping those atomic bombs was a way of ending the war more quickly and actually saving lives in the long run. Nevertheless, conservatives such as Russell Kirk, who's the author of The Conservative Mind and who, in fact, is one of the founders of Modern Age in 1957, Richard Weaver, who is the author of a book called Ideas Have Consequences in 1949, and Robert Nisbet, who's the author of a book in 1953 called The Quest for Community. Kirk, Nisbet, and Weaver are three of the most important traditional conservative thinkers of the post-war era. They're three of the founding fathers of conservatism as it develops after World War II. And all three of them thought that there was a great moral loss that the West had experienced in its embrace of total war, quite apart from the necessity of the war. There was the idea that the values that had guided Western civilization in the wars of the past, especially the value of chivalry, had fallen by the wayside. And that was because we had embraced a kind of industrial ethos. We had embraced a utilitarianism, even a Machiavellianism, about ends justifying the means, which was distinctly contrary to the Christian ethos, contrary to the just war tradition that had been developed from St. Augustine onwards, and contrary to the best practices and traditions of chivalry during the Middle Ages. Now, of course, it may seem excessively romantic to talk about chivalry and the idea of the way that warfare was conducted in the Middle Ages in the context of the 20th and now 21st centuries. Russell Kirk, Robert Nisbet, and Richard Weaver, and other conservatives of the post-war era, they were not romantics. They were not idealists. They did not have a kind of rose-tinted view of foreign policy and war. On the contrary, they had experiences of war themselves. Russell Kirk was, in fact, in a chemical weapons testing ground in Utah during World War II, where he, saw the use of the most horrible kinds of weapons as, trying to create countermeasures against them. But nevertheless, it was an introduction to just how awful weapons of mass destruction can be. Robert Nisbet served honorably in the Pacific Theater during the Second World War. So these men were not strangers to the realities of combat, to the realities of the most horrible kinds of weapons and the most horrible kinds of enemy tactics during the Second World War. Nevertheless, they saw that it was not enough to defeat totalitarianism on the battleground. You also had to defeat it in the realm of ideas and in the human soul. And that required a recovery of what had been great about Western civilization and what had allowed us to create a code like chivalry in the first place. That meant revisiting the greatest strengths of the West in religion, in philosophy, and in our history before this 20th century era of total war. That's why Russell Kirk writes The Conservative Mind in 1953. It's why Richard Weaver writes Ideas of Consequences in 1949. And it's why Robert Nisbet writes a book like The Quest for Community in 1953, same year as Russell Kirk's Conservative Mind. By the way, if you want to read more about Robert Nisbet's thoughts on war, particularly the Vietnam War, I recommend a book called The Twilight of Authority and also another one called The Present Age. So those are two books by Robert Nisbet where he talks about the nature of war even after the Second World War and in the Vietnam conflict. Now, in Vietnam, of course, that seems to be a great example of a war that conservatives supported and where all the opponents were on the left. And yet that, too, is not an accurate impression. In fact, there were a number of conservatives, including Robert Nisbet, who were quite critical of America's involvement in the Vietnam War. They saw it as being something that was probably not going to succeed, and they saw it as not necessary for America's own security. Now, as with the Iraq War in 2003, the conservative critics of the Vietnam War were typically either ignored or sidelined, and instead there was a great deal of focus on left-wing critics of those wars. But the left-wing critics of those wars, it's worth pointing out, were often not so much anti-war as on the other side, or simply anti-American. And so there's a great deal of difference between the left-wing anti-war tendency that you find during the Vietnam War and the Iraq War and the conservative critics of those wars. The conservative critics are not being anti-American, and they're not saying that war is never necessary. They're not being romantic or idealistic. Instead, they're saying that these wars are really about nation building, promoting democracy, and engaging in attempts to deliver a system of government that may not be sustainable within the countries where these wars are taking place. In the case of Vietnam, there were Democrats, there were people who, small d Democrats who wanted their country to be free from communist influence, and yet there was so much communist influence within Vietnam itself, coming from the north, but also coming from segments of the south as well, that it was going to be very, very difficult to create an order there that would be free from communism. And in fact, it proved to be impossible. And even today, Vietnam is still run by a communist government. In the case of Iraq, the difficulty was how on earth were you going to import these values of liberalism and democracy, these very Western ideas, into a state like Iraq after toppling a dictator such as Saddam Hussein. There just wasn't a plausible path for doing that. The people who were supporting the war in 2003, supporters of the Iraq War, they, in fact, were the more idealistic people. They were the less realistic ones. They were not practical-minded folks who saw war as being a necessity. Instead, they were people who had utopian dreams of being able to create a kind of Switzerland in the Middle East. And in fact, they even said that that Iraq would be turned into a model for exemplifying democracy and liberalism and peace for the rest of the Middle East after a successful regime change operation there. Well, conservative critics such as Pat Buchanan and Robert Novak, both saw this as being a utopian folly that was being pursued not so much by traditional conservatives, but by a faction of conservatives known as neoconservatives. And the neoconservatives of 2003 had embraced this idea of war as bringing about a revolution for the sake of liberalism and democracy. They were very much influenced by the thought of someone like Francis Fukuyama, a thinker who had promoted this idea that liberalism and democracy were the end of history and were the ultimate endpoint and goal of the development of governments almost everywhere. And there was this idealistic sense that people all around the world naturally have a craving not only for freedom, but for freedom specifically as Americans understand it, and as it is outlined in our Declaration of Independence. Now, this is tremendously naive, and this involves ignoring the history of other countries, ignoring the fact that other peoples around the world in their own nations have a perhaps aspiration for freedom, but freedom on their own terms as they understand it. And that if you actually bring democracy to some of these countries, it will turn out to be a very illiberal kind of democracy, or a democracy that may wind up empowering sectarians and religious radicals as opposed to empowering the kind of secular liberal Democrats with a small l and a small d that many neoconservatives and many supporters of the 2003 Iraq War thought would be brought to power as a result of U.S. intervention. So this is the backdrop to the debate today over America's involvement in the Middle East. And one of the questions is, if America gets involved in further operations against a state like Iran, is it really just a matter of trying to deprive Iran of a nuclear weapons program, trying to deprive Iran of the means of harming Israel? Is there in fact a greater ambition here to bring about regime change in Iran, not just because the Iranian regime as it exists now is a revolutionary Islamist regime that is very evil and oppressive, but because there is this hope that by bringing about a change in regime in Iran, you will thereby bring about a democratization, a liberalization, and a westernization of Iranian political culture. That is the same kind of argument that we saw being made in 2003 in support of the Iraq War, and that's an argument that conservatives do not buy. Conservatives do not think that if you go in and overthrow a tyrannical government, that the necessary and swift result will be the creation of a free government, because in fact there are a number of other bad outcomes that can happen. You can wind up replacing one tyranny, one despotism, with another that's just as bad or even worse. You can wind up creating a situation of civil war and of a bloodbath within the civil strife of a country, which may wind up being, in fact, even worse than a dictatorship was. And Russell Kirk, is very careful within a book called The Roots of American Order, where he talks about America's, devotion to order, virtue, and stability. He says in there that order is the first requirement. Order is the first thing that you need in order to have any kind of civilization. And he even quotes the example of an anti-communist Russian during Russia's civil war in which the Bolsheviks are gaining power. This is after World War I, where an anti-communist Russian says to someone who's interviewing him that in fact, he would rather see the Bolsheviks win than see the Civil War continue. And that's not because this Russian had any illusions about the Bolsheviks being less than tyrannical, less than horrible and murderous, but he simply said that without peace, without order, nothing else can happen. And what we saw, and what we've seen, in fact, throughout the past century, is that these revolutionary despotisms, when they do gain power, wind up being unsustainable, and they weaken over time. That was certainly the case with the Soviet Union, which, once it was contained, wound up being unable to perpetuate itself and ultimately collapsing in 1989, and then the Soviet Union itself falls apart in 1991. That's because this revolutionary regime of communism was predicated on a false understanding of human nature. It was, a revolution that was brought about by Lenin and by other Bolsheviks in the name of human equality and in the name of, destroying tyranny and creating a supposedly free regime. But people very quickly saw that, in fact, what the Bolsheviks had realized and created was a regime that was much more despotic, much more tyrannical than that of the Tsar who had been overthrown. Well, revolutionary regimes tend to have that outcome always and almost everywhere. So we saw that also with the French Revolution. The French Revolution goes from being a revolution supposedly in the name of liberté, égalité, fraternité, and instead becoming a bloodthirsty regime where the revolutionaries themselves, first they guillotine their opponents in the aristocracy and they murder and execute the king, but then they wind up executing one another. The revolution devours itself, devours its own children, and the French Revolution, which started with these high ideals of democracy and something resembling liberty, winds up becoming a directorate and ultimately an empire under Napoleon. Similarly, the Bolshevik Revolution very quickly goes from, being something that is a form of, radical violence that is carried out in the name of a number of ideals, to being violence and oppression that clearly has no ideals whatsoever, and that is simply an effort to maintain power for the Bolsheviks once they have built their new regime. The Iranian regime, I think, has a similar problem, that it too came to power in 1979, claiming to be overthrowing a Shah who was using secret police, who were torturing people, a Shah who was cracking down on religious clerics. And the Iranian Revolution, even though it was certainly not a revolution in the name of liberalism or democracy, it claimed to be fighting a kind of tyranny. But very quickly, as soon as these Shiite radicals take power, they expose themselves as being just as despotic and in fact much more despotic and much more tyrannical than the regime they replaced. This is why the Iranian regime is weak today, because it has come to power in the name of a number of ideals in 1979, but has proven over the course of the last 50 years to be in fact just another tyrannical, despotic regime, which has not brought about the kind of religious restoration and renovation that the supporters of the revolution might have hoped for back in 1979. Now, we American conservatives, and those of us who were critical of the Iraq War back in 2003, people like Pat Buchanan and Robert Novak and myself, we say that when you have regime changes in these states, you're very likely to create new revolutionary conditions that may in fact bring new kinds of despotism and new kinds of tyranny to power. And what you may wind up doing is replacing an old and defeated kind of revolutionary spirit, like you see in Iran right now, with a newly inflamed and renovated kind of revolutionary spirit. And throughout the Middle East, certainly over the past century, we've actually seen a number of different kinds of revolutionary and despotic movements. So before the current wave of Islamism, about 50 to 60 years ago, instead you had Arab nationalism that was driving terrorism and that was creating despotic regimes like Saddam Hussein's. So you have to be very careful that you don't simply replace one kind of evil regime with another, which is why conservatives are generally very skeptical and opposed to regime change. Sometimes it might be necessary, but even when it winds up being necessary, it's very likely to lead to situations that are complicated at the very least, and that could in fact be, in the long run, worse than the situation that existed under an old and decrepit and weakening despotism. I want to conclude by just saying that conservatives have a sense that what is most important is to maintain order here at home. And there's a tendency for wars to become endeavors or enterprises that give new strength to various kinds of progressive and left-wing movements right here at home as well. Because the kind of centralization of power that characterizes modern war is precisely parallel to the centralization of power that progressives would like to see take root here at home. It's actually why you see such a close correspondence between, for example, Franklin Roosevelt as the architect of the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt as the president of, in power during World War II. It's why someone like Harry Truman, who's carrying on and institutionalizing the New Deal further, is also the architect of the national security state during the Cold War. And it's why during the Vietnam War itself can be understood as a kind of great society. That was the name of Lyndon Johnson's domestic political program. The Vietnam War is in some respects a foreign expression or a foreign export of the great society and its view of politics. So the same things that lead to the concentration of power and the promotion of radical left-wing ideas here at home are often involved in America's foreign policy and in the wars we fight abroad. That's another reason why conservatives are very, very skeptical and very reluctant to get involved in foreign conflicts unless absolutely necessary. And that's why, over time, you've seen the people who were condemned by neoconservatives in 2003 as so-called unpatriotic conservatives, people like Pat Buchanan, people like Robert Novak, people who put America first. It's why they've been vindicated over the last 20 plus years, that they have in fact informed and become part of the Make America Great movement that Donald Trump leads today, and why you see right now there is a great deal of debate on the American right over foreign policy and a great deal of concern that there could be a reversion to the kind of foreign policy that was flawed and that was conducted by George W. Bush and that was overseen by the neocons in the 2000s and 2003 and basically 20 years ago. There is a tremendous need for conservatives to remind themselves time and time again of the evil revolutionary potential in wars abroad. And there's the potential to bring about cultural revolutions at home, as well as to bring about changes abroad in foreign countries that wind up empowering and actually worsening the situation that our wars are fought to try to resolve. American conservatives, from the founding fathers like Russell Kirk and Robert Nisbet and Richard Weaver, through to the great conservatives of the 2003 era, like Pat Buchanan and Robert Novak, have been critical of nation building. They've been critical of regime change. They've been critical of wars that are not absolutely necessary for our national interest and that are not limited and brief and to the point. And we find that Donald Trump right now in the Middle East seems to understand this very, very well. He has conducted a very brief war. He's joined a war that Israel was already fighting, and he's brought it to a conclusion and a ceasefire. He's deprived Iran of a nuclear weapons program, which would have been an existential threat to Israel and would have been quite dangerous to the entire world. It would have created a danger of nuclear proliferation throughout the region as other neighboring countries tried to match Iran's nuclear program with weapons of their own for their own defense. That situation has been resolved by a very brief use of force by President Trump. And we're hoping and praying that the ceasefire is maintained and that the situation is resolved. It's going to be very difficult. Tremendous diplomacy is going to be called for in the weeks and months to come, perhaps for years as well. But the key thing to keep in mind is that America uses force in a limited way, in a realistic way, and that we should not be idealistic about foreign policy, about the potential for war. We should not have the kinds of utopian dreams that the George W. Bush administration entertained, that Democrats like Woodrow Wilson and Lyndon Johnson entertained, and that have led us into conflicts that have wound up creating worse situations abroad and also worse situations at home.